Hello friends, today we'll be talking about Grimdark. So defining Grimdark is difficult because no one can agree on what it really means. Some people don't think it's even a thing, some people don't think it's even a subgenre of fantasy, so no one can agree. In a way that makes it more interesting to me because it's fun to have these discussions and fun to talk about it. Now, before we get started, I am no authority on Grimdark or on fantasy or anything else. I have no idea what I'm doing. We're just having fun. We're just having a conversation. So if you don't agree with me, then let's talk about it. Let's have a fun conversation. It's just a discussion. So let's have fun with this. So I'm going to share with you the top 5 things I look for in a book that I consider grimdark. My friend Yuleen from Yuleen Reads recently did a video similar to this one where she discussed what she considers to be grimdark and not grimdark. I'm going to leave that up above and down below if you want to check that out. Now, at the end of my portion, when I name the top 5 things I look for before I consider something to be grimdark, I'm going to leave clips of conversations and interviews that I've done with people who know a whole lot more about grimdark and writing and storytelling than I do, from authors that I've talked to that when they define what grimdark means to them. I think that'd be fun, like a compilation of authors, because I've asked a ton of authors what they think grimdark is, and I'm going to leave that at the end of the video after I do my portion. Now first, let me name 2 things that I think a lot of people think grimdark has to be, that I don't think it has to be. So let's start off with 2 things to get this out of the way. Now, grimdark can be these things, but it doesn't have to be, in my mind, to be considered grimdark. The first thing is nihilism. I don't think a story has to be nihilistic to be grimdark. Another thing is hopelessness. I don't think a story has to be hopeless to be grimdark. In fact, there's lots of hope in lots of grimdark stories that it may seem hopeless at first, but there is hope. There is light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that's important to note before I get into my list of my top 5 things that I look for. So let's start off with that. I don't think it has to be hopeless, and I don't think it has to be nihilistic. So let's get that out of the way. So first on my list is consequences. These stories have consequences. Things matter. Things that happen matter. And things that happen in the books not only matter for a short period of time, but they create these mental and physical scars in these characters that they carry throughout the book, throughout the story. The characters change as we go through the story because of the events that happen in the story. So they just don't brush everything off and keep moving. These events have a major impact on the story moving forward. So if someone dies, that death is meaningful because it impacts the story. It's not just, oh, someone's dead, let's keep moving. That often will have consequences later. If a character chooses a certain path and they decide to do something terrible, those decisions matter. There's consequences to actions. There's consequences to what characters decide to do or to not do. So that's really important. That's the first thing that I look for is consequences. Because a lot of times in fantasy, things will happen, people will die, decisions will be made, and it doesn't really matter because you know what's going to happen. Well, not so in grimdark, at least on my list. Now, number 2 on my list is morally gray characters. The characters are morally gray. There's not good versus evil. Oftentimes you find yourself jumping from character to character, trying to decide who to root for. So there's no black and white. Everything is gray. Characters are flawed. Characters are damaged. And it's a lot like life. I mean, everyone's damaged a little bit. Everyone has scars. Everyone has issues that they're dealing with. And I love grimdark for that reason because the characters are never perfect. They make mistakes. They do dumb things. They do terrible things. But in those terrible things they do, there's oftentimes redemption in those terrible things that we see later. Or there's, like I said, consequences to those terrible things. So if a character does really terrible things, then something will happen because of those things. Whether it's you agree with it or not, those decisions, like I said, matter. And these characters are not good versus evil. The traditional fantasy model of good versus evil, you know who's going to win. You know what's going to happen. And yes, you can enjoy the ride to get there. and that's fine. But for me, I enjoy the ride of watching characters that are more true to life, more true to what would really happen. And that's really what makes Grimdark so interesting to me, is that you jump back and forth between different characters because none of them are perfect, none of them are infallible, they all make mistakes. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Now, the third item on my list is unpredictability. You never know what to expect because the characters are all flawed, because these worlds have consequences. You never know what's going to happen. Whenever I get into a Grimdark book, I expect in some ways for my boundaries to be pushed. I expect for the story to surprise me. I expect for it to go places I didn't expect it to go and be surprised and shocked, or whether it's good or bad. I expect it to be dark and gritty, and I also expect the atmosphere to be dark as well. Not only in the storytelling is dark and gritty, but also the atmosphere. The world I expect to be dark and gritty. And with that unpredictability, I expect it also to be unforgiving. If the story takes us someplace to where a character makes a decision with these consequences, that there will be, things will happen, whether I agree with them or not, whether it's good for the character or bad for the character. I expect it to be unforgiving when it's time to pay the price for these actions that are taken. Number 4 on my list are the themes. In addition for my boundaries to be pushed, I expect the themes to be thought-provoking. I expect to think about it. I expect to question my own morality, my own decisions, my own thoughts. I expect to be conflicted, and I expect to think about it long after I'm done reading the book. I expect these stories to have an impact on me, whether it's good or bad. I expect a reaction from these stories. I expect myself to be, like I said, in the process of reading the story, I expect to jump back and forth. I expect to be surprised, all these other things, but I also expect for these themes to be heavy in themes, but not heavy-handed in themes. I don't want it to be pushed on my throat, but I do want those themes to be there for me to think about them long after I finish reading the book. And I can name off a ton of books that I've read that I've thought about long after reading them, but one that I've read recently is The Winter Road, which has a ton of themes in it, but it's not heavy-handed. Or even something like Gunmetal Gods, with these characters that you jump back and forth because you're not sure who to root for. And there's so many things you can do in this genre, so many boundaries you can push, so many characters you can create in these worlds, that there's so many possibilities. And I feel like other subgenres in fantasy are more rigid, and you don't have as much wiggle room to create characters. You have you do have a little bit of wiggle room there, but I think in Grimdark you have a lot more freedom to create these different stories and different characters with these different outcomes that you typically don't see in fantasy, just in traditional fantasy. Now, let me just mention, I'm not here trying to bag on traditional fantasy. I like traditional fantasy as much as, well, I don't really like traditional fantasy, but I understand why people do like it. So I'm not trying to be insulting. It's just my perspective on Grimdark versus traditional fantasy. I get why people enjoy it. It's great. We all enjoy different things. Just me personally, I don't enjoy traditional fantasy because it is more rigid. You do know what to expect. Things take a path most of the time. Things have a formula. It's like a cookie cutter that you just kind of cut the cookie and it's the same type of cookie almost all the time. So again, I'm not trying to be insulting. It's just my personal tastes. I enjoy Grimdark a lot more because of the reasons I just mentioned. So my number 5 on this list, I was a little conflicted about because I think it's not always. So this comes with an asterisk on this one. But the 5th item on my list that I look for in Grimdark is low fantasy. I think lots of times these stories have a low fantasy setting. They don't depend so much on magic and magic systems. It's more down to earth and grounded. There can be magic, but I think most of them are low magic. And don't get me wrong, there's some great Grimdark books that have some really great magic systems in them, but I think most of the time it is a more of a low magic, low fantasy type of setting because it is more grounded and more gritty and dark. So those are the top 5 things I look for before I label something as Grimdark fantasy. Now again, that's just my list. I'm curious to hear your list. What are the top 5 things you look for before you label something as Grimdark fantasy? So I'm going to leave you with some clips from discussions and interviews I've had with authors in the genre that have shared their thoughts on what Grimdark means to them. I hope you enjoy. Please let me know down below what you consider to be Grimdark. I think it's a fun conversation to have. Again, I am no authority on this. It's just for fun. But I hope you enjoy hearing so many different perspectives. We can all agree to disagree, or maybe Grimdark just isn't even a thing. It's just we're talking about nothing. So hope you enjoy, and here you go.
Yeah, I think for me, that last bit is true. Boundaries to be pushed, because you can't help but see that there's this comfort boundary to most books these days that writers are sort of, tiptoeing around. It's like, should I cross? Should I not cross it? And grimdark writers are just running out. But that's reality. That's what realistic means to me. That if something bad's gonna happen, sometimes nobody's gonna save you.
Yeah.
It's newspaper stuff, really. Force you to see reality at its worst, and sometimes you get the best of humanity in the midst of that, and that's what I love about Grimdark. Yeah, I was so excited to have discovered that term, because I've been looking for books like that without knowing what it's called. Yeah, and then I ran into that term. I started looking it up, and yeah, bingo! Like every book that falls on the grimdark definition has me.
I think Grimdark is built kind of on systems that support the difficulty and the bleakness and the ugliness, and so whether or not the characters are morally gray is kind of a sliding scale, and whether or not it's super violent is a sliding scale. But it feels like what they're fighting against, if it's a big bad evil that's very contained, it's not Grimdark. But if they're fighting against humanity's darkest nature in a way that's really widespread, it starts to fall into that category where Grimdark is a place where people kind of make eye contact with how ugly the average person is capable of being, and ask some pretty uncomfortable questions. And I think, and so it's a spectrum, and some of us, and Fortune's Fool is really close to the far end of the spectrum, where it's starting to toe the line a little bit, but it's kind of hard. Nobody seems to really agree. And then you get into me at Brightwash, where the system is very oppressive and very bleak, and energy units, but there's still hope and there's still a lot of love. And then you get into Clayton Snyder's work, and certainly he flirts with the idea of hope, but man, you really got to work for it, and you've got to suffer a lot to get it. And so I think Grimdark is built on the wider system of how hard life can be, and that's not to say that other genres don't. It's just, I think it's an important theme, a core value of the genre that makes it slide into some uncomfortable things for people. So if Angela, you have anything to add?
No, I mean, because Grimdark it's really hard to kind of, like you get 10 people together who write dark fantasy, and they're all going to have different definitions for it. And like Krystle said, a lot of times, like when I was writing Fortune's Fool, and after it came out, I would say it's not that dark, is it? And people would be like, yes, there are those things in it that are very dark, Angela. But I do think that it has something to do, probably because you can have morally gray characters, you can have grimy worlds, you can have all that, and you can still have them in classic fantasy or high fantasy. And I think I don't know but I'm sort of leaning toward a definition where it has to do, like Krystle said, with the institutions and the systemic nature of the world, where it's just the bleakness kind of through it, and the characters may not have a lot of agency to change that. So they're sort of working towards something, maybe, but what they're working
not.
well, but what they're working toward may not lead to like the standard, classic
Happy.
fantasy happy ending, or a happy for now ending. Even it may be much more conflicted, so that you're looking at like what the choices the characters make, where you're trying to figure out where the grayness comes in. They're not black and white. They're not definitively good or bad. They're some sort of mix and dependent on circumstance. So I think that people often they kind of confuse grimdark with things that are really violent, or stories that have just a bunch of awful people in them. And certainly I think some grimdark books can have that, but I don't think that that's really what the subgenre is all about. It's a certain set of books are like that, but they don't define grimdark.
To me, it means consequences. It's kind of the antithesis of the rainbows and unicorns, everybody lives happily ever after kind of epic fantasy, where you can go fight a great big war and nobody's got PTSD afterwards and nobody's lost any limbs or anything horrible like that. Whereas Grimdark's the exact opposite of that to me. It doesn't necessarily mean horrible people doing evil things, but it means there are consequences to your actions, and probably not everybody's going to get out alive, because in history, in real wars, it just doesn't work like that.
No,
So
definitely not.
that's kind of what it means to me. But as I say, we've established it means a different thing to everybody, I think.
See, I actually see it as not so much the kind of the violence, although obviously the violence is a big part of it. As I said, I mean, a lot of something like The Wheel of Time tends to kind of rather draw a veil over exactly what's going on, and the fact that what the goodies are doing is also horrible, and there's that kind of glorification of war. That was kind of those wonderful children's television programs you watch, where there are these huge battles where you realize that no one's got killed.
Yeah.
And kind of it's that sort of level of you're obviously you're kind of striding around killing a whole lot of people, but you don't really see that. And so the violence is obviously a big part of it, but for me the point is the cynicism, or the kind of realism, the realpolitik, the kind of awareness that it's much more complicated than good versus evil. That kind of, even if you do have a character who is good, what the things that they're doing are going to have consequences which may be catastrophically bad. It's that kind of real world. And yes, it does become cynical, and it does become that sort of taking apart the kind of concept of the leader, really trying to sort of like taking apart a bit what's going on. I actually always think of some Terry Pratchett's books as profoundly grimdark in some ways, because it's that constant kind of, your heroes of Feet of Clay. That one, there's a wonderful line, Rincewind has one somewhere, which is, who wants to die for their principles? You've only got one life, but you can pick up another set of principles. We just turn down the next street. It's that kind of incredible cynicism, but also incredible kind of realism. That kind of, what are you doing? Yeah. Kind of attack on fanaticism on either side. That kind of. So I actually always say that grimdark kind of. You look at when people like Abercrombie and Mark Lawrence first start writing. Actually, though, it comes out of a kind of time when it feels a bit safer to be writing that very kind of deliberately writing the anti-hero, someone like George, where you're deliberately writing a character who is absolutely appalling beyond any kind of pale. He is so far beyond any kind of line anyone could draw.
I think one of the beauties of great characters is they allow you as a reader to question your morality through them. So you'll find yourself agreeing with something a character does. And then on the next page, you're like, wait, what the hell? Like that, wait a minute, I don't like you anymore, right? So, but you find yourself with this struggle of, you are able to understand the motivations of a character who's objectively not good. And it allows you to reflect on that yourself. So combining that with like the idea of religious being a societal construct of power and things like that, I really liked how you combined those two systems of like gray characters and morality with that. Because kind of as Lana mentioned, I was also sitting with that when I was reading. And that also does lead into the idea of love as well. You know, what is an acceptable form of love, and what is not. And is love shown, is like in the case of, I think you said Micah is how you pronounce his name? Micah. So in his case, his form of love was quite violent, you know, and so it's just his way of showing that. And you could kind of see why he does it that way. And then you're like, wait a minute, why do I agree with this in this moment? So I really thought you did a really good job of showing great characters and using them in that potential. So I really wanted to make sure I said that before we moved on from that topic. But well done. I had many thoughts inside my head doubting why I agreed with these people. So
yeah,
well done.
that always interests me, because like when I read history, you'll often see that a lot of people, or a lot of the great figures that we talk about, they'll do something really terrible, and we just won't be able to wrap our heads around it. And I guess I kind of wanted to explore what would cause someone to do that. And one of the things I realized was that, you know, if you're in a position of power, it's just not very simple. Like, I think in the book, there's sometimes these situations where, and this is kind of common in Grimdark as well, where a character has to choose between mercy and dealing out some kind of punishment. And sometimes they'll choose mercy, and that will come back to bite them in the ass later, where the guy that they spared will come and try to kill them later or something. And, you know, so I kind of, and when you're in a position of power, you know, if you allow yourself to get killed, your whole kingdom could destabilize and it could cause chaos. So I kind of really wanted to get into this whole thing where, you know, it's not always clear what the right thing to do is, because there's so many factors you have to weigh. And that's also one of my favorite things about Grimdark, is that it explores that, you know, that whole aspect.
So first things first, we need to address the elephant in the room, which causes a lot of discourse with Grimdark, and that is Warhammer 40K, particularly the fan base. So, you know, I'm sure you know, but for those of you who don't know, Grimdark was coined from the tabletop RPG Warhammer 40K. I have not played it because it is expensive to get into. I will stick to D&D. But basically, many fans of that game will not consider anything Grimdark unless it's Warhammer 40K. You know, like basically there's requirement for it. But the general consensus between readers and writers, you know, outside the elephant in the room, is it has to have three characteristics, not one or the other. It has to have all three. First one's obvious. Violence. Violence means grit. Means show me the blood on the walls. Let me hear the bones crack. Let me see the gurgling blood and the person dying in the treetop after he fell and broke his neck. Second is morally gray characters. Not necessarily good, not necessarily bad. They'll do good things for bad reasons. They'll do bad things for good reasons. And yeah, so you have that. The third one is dystopian. Now, with the dystopian element, I usually describe this in more detail because in a lot of science fiction readers, who, when you think of dystopian, they're thinking of a kind of like a more or less like a utopian society with some bleak elements off to the side, which causes usually the rebellion that happens within the middle of those books. So for dystopian, it's basically the setting itself is bleak in some way. Now in 2, there is the physical setting that is bleak. In which case it's just a miserable place to live. We have those here in America. We have them all over the place. And then there's the social aspect of a dystopian. That is like the people around you are not pleasant to deal with, and therefore like you hate them, and someone's bound to get stabbed. Anyway, almost sounds like real life when you really think about it.
Yeah.
But like if you look at like Game of Thrones, it has both of that. Like if you go up towards the north, you have the setting. It's like very, very cold, despite it not being winter, and it's just a general bleak setting. Even though those probably have the most morally stable characters up there, and then you go down south where you're dealing with the Lannisters, and then that's a very comfortable place to live. But socially, it's very bleak because you never know when the king decides to go and say, "Hey, we're gonna kill off all the orphans and the little children because of their power." So, yeah,
there's always that.
I mean, do you know what? Grimdark's a funny one because I've had so many people say to me, like, your book's not a grimdark book. It's not that grim and dark. And then I've had other people who have like messaged me and said, why have you written this book? Like, it's so dark and like grim and horrible and I can't read it. So it's one of those things where it's so personal and it's so down to the individual like reader, but to define what grimdark is to them and what dark fantasy is to them, for me, I would say grimdark it's a more gritty, it's a more realistic style of dark fantasy. So it's very focused on the human elements. There's lots of grimdark books out there that are magical, but for me, the ones that really resonate are the ones that are very real world, very low fantasy. It's all about the scenarios that people find themselves in, where there's like trauma and there's difficulty, and how they, either overcome it or they don't, and all the relationships that they build around these scenarios.
I wanted to ask you all, like how and why. Was this a coincidence? Was this just a choice? Because, the themes which you wanted to explore were so grimdark, and now it is what it is.
I think he's asking what the hell is wrong with us.
That was the subtext.
I guess I'll go first. It's even worse than that for me. I had no idea I was writing grimdark. And I actually thought I was pulling my punches. So that turned out not to be true. So I guess for me, I was trying to reflect what I thought was the reality of a Iron Age philosophy and technology world. That's really it. So, I was trying to do justice to the world building of a court with, kings and all the imperial powers and all the wonderful nonsense that monarchy gets up to, and the reality of having scarce resources and the difficulty of life really for all of human history, save for the last few hundred years. So that's what I was going for, and it just turns out that the average person thinks that is very dark.
Who wants to go next?
Sarah does. You can tell.
Why,
you can read it.
Why are you
read it in her face.
No,
he was like,
I have 2 of your books right now, and I could just like destroy them. So you want to be nice to me, is what I'm saying. I'm like Richard. I had no idea Seraphina's Lament was grimdark, and then the reviews started coming in, and people said, "Oh, this is dark," and I said, "That's interesting. I didn't know that was dark." And so it was kind of, and they also said, "You write very emotional stuff," and I said, I didn't know that either. So when I released that book, I learned a whole lot about myself that I never knew.
And I think I gravitate towards darker themes because they're more interesting to me. I mean, like, happiness is fine, but you really get my attention when someone's in a lot of pain. So that's basically how I look at life. I don't generally start caring until someone is hurting a lot somehow. So it was just, really a matter of time.
What is wrong with us, indeed?
Yeah.
Nobody reads a story that just starts with a happy ending, though.
I can go next. I'm just frustrated as a reader because I read mostly fantasy, and I'm old. I'm too old to believe that life is gonna be great. Everything's gonna turn out fine in the end. Everyone is that the heroes are incorruptible, and it's just not believable to me anymore at this age. And I always say I write for me because nobody is writing this for me. I have a specific thing I want to read. I know what I want to read, and when I can't find enough books like that, I write them. Yeah, I think it's mostly age that has sort of made me feel like those like I can't get into young adults a lot these days because some of them are really dark, but it's not grim dark. It doesn't feel realistic. It's I wouldn't say that there isn't hope anymore in this world. I mean, there is, but I mean, it's gonna be somewhat tainted, and your expectation of the world has to be a little bit lower than that to survive well in it and not get disappointed by life all the time. And I don't want to read something that tricks me into thinking what I was thinking when I was a teen, and then having been disappointed with everything up to this point. And yeah, so I'm, it's a frustration that gets me writing grimdark pretty much. And I found out the term, and I found out all these authors that are doing it. I love it. Fletcher, I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think like everybody else, like I never thought I was writing grimdark. I thought I was writing dark fantasy, like C.S. Friedman kind of dark fantasy, and similar. I mean, I was disillusioned with, heroic fantasy, and all the guys have nice hair and washboard abs, and all the women are gorgeous, and the food is tasty, and the beer is amazing. And I was just like, fuck, this is horse shit. I just wanted to write something where no one, like there was this huge quest and this adventure, and no one learned anything. And at the end, all the people who were shitty to begin with are still shitty. And I was like, that's life. None of this like, oh, I learned so much and now I'm a better person. I'm like, fuck off. So, I mean, for me, that was beyond redemption. Now things have changed since then, and I'm, in a different place.
Well, I'm 30% into that book right now, and I say you've achieved what you were trying to write.
I feel like I just learned the ending of the Blackstone Heart.
Now, at Blackstone, the Obsidian Path stuff, that's kind of, it's written from a different place, and years and years later, like I wrote Beyond Redemption in 2009. That was a while ago.
Yeah. So are you saying you've become more hopeful in your old age?
I'm like this soft, cuddly teddy bear now. All my stories have happy endings. Everybody like hugs and they talk out their issues, and it's touchy-feely, and they're kittens. Oh, it's so good.
Okay, well, he's out of the club.
The heroes have nice hair.
Yeah, he writes some killer romance. Excellent romance. Real hearts kind of stuff.
Yeah, where you actually take out the heart, right?
Yeah, you got to take it out first.
Yeah, when
But,
when
yeah.
Fletcher says heart to heart, it is literally heart to heart.
Literally, yeah. Stitch them together, and yeah, it's great.
So, Mark, why do you enjoy reading Grimdark?
Well, I mean, at this point, I think there is something that goes along with, like, the older you get, it just, like, you become a little bit more cynical. Some of us become a lot more cynical, but there is something with getting older, and it's just harder to buy into the heroic fantasy, I guess. But I've been kind of this way though forever. I would say I've always been a little twisted. I've loved the darker side of stuff. I'm an 80s kid, so like I grew up in, horror slashers, the heyday of blood on the screen and just people in danger and dying. And I watched a whole lot of shit I shouldn't have at a young age, and even the stuff that was being put out that kids could watch was still dark. Like, go back and watch, like, what is it, Kroll, and it's like a G-rated movie. But people are dying. When the Slayers die, they make the most god-awful sounds. Ridley Scott's Legend is dark as shit. I'm pretty sure it's only PG, but that movie specifically really fucked me up. Like, Blick's darkness and Meg Mucklebones were just terrifying, and they haunted me as a kid. But that really fascinated me, though, too, in some other way, right? And so now I'm interested in these things that are scaring the shit out of me. And I feel like I've always kind of held on to that. And Grimdark definitely is it has a piece of that, I also love punk rock stuff, and I feel like Grimdark is the subgenre that has a fuck you attitude. So I can get behind that a lot more than other books. I just think that's the stuff that I'm going to go look for. I kind of want an uncompromising take on storytelling. And that's something interesting, like Richard was saying, about just kind of trying to stay true to an era. But it's like, history is pretty brutal. And so when you like stay true to it, now you have like kind of an uncompromising world, right? And that's awesome. I like that kind of stuff. Like, it once again, it rings true to that. People are in danger. Oh shit, motherfuckers are getting cut up. Like, this is fun. I don't know. I've always just dug it. I don't think I'll ever stop digging it. Yeah. People are always like, "Oh man, do you ever need to read something else?" I'm like, nope. I really don't.